Hello and welcome to today's introduction to Silect Baseline Manager. Baseline Manager helps you address key lifecycle issues when working with configuration baselines. The first is authoring and development of baselines for use within your environment. Secondly is the deployment of those baselines, typically within an SCCM environment. And last but certainly not least is the maintenance of those baselines over time. Today's introduction is going to touch on each of those three key lifecycle stages. Let's start by looking at some of the baseline authoring capabilities of Silect Baseline Manager. Within our user interface, we have a couple of policy folders. Folders are used to help organize the baselines that we'll be working with. As you can see, we do ship the Microsoft Security Compliance baselines for use within your environment. And I've created here a folder called Silect to create a new baseline that's going to reflect our standard workstation configuration. I'm going to create that baseline by using our Golden Master Wizard. So I'm going to scan a machine on my network. In this case, I'm going to scan my local machine and pick off key configuration settings that we want to use as part of this golden image that we're creating. I'm going to look at the operating system. I'll scan for some applications. I can also scan for some application details, including file and folder information, as well as I can scan for group policy settings. I'm just going to skip over the group policy settings for this demonstration. We're going to automatically determine the operating system and pick up some artifacts of the operating system. I'm then going to look at installed applications. And here's where I can define which applications I want to include as rules within the configuration baseline that we're creating. Finally, we're going to provide it with a name. And using the Golden Master Wizard, we've created a new baseline that reflects a standard workstation configuration. At this point in time, I can review the baseline that's been created. Here we see a number of CIs related to the operating system, as well as some of the required applications. I can choose to add additional CIs to this particular baseline if I want to include a rule on perhaps a prohibited application. Perhaps I want to include a general setting that could reflect some very detailed and granular information about file system, registry, SQL, WMI. You can see the list. We can create some very, very detailed settings within the baseline that we're developing. Next, let's look at some deployment scenarios using Silect Baseline Manager. Perhaps a vendor has provided you with a new baseline. What I can do is I can import that baseline from disk. So let's go ahead and look at our own Sentinel Security Pack baseline. And after I've imported that into our version control database, I'll be able to open the baseline and review the different capabilities that are included within the baseline. Here I can see a number of configuration items that have been defined, including things like making sure auditing is enabled, guest accounts, etc., etc. I can look at some information about each one of these CIs. And before deploying this, after I've done a review, what I can do is I can test this. So I can run a simulation of the deployment of this particular policy within my environment. And I can apply this policy against one or more systems within my environment. Let's just go ahead and test this against my local host. What I'm going to do is just view the results after the testing has been completed. Once the testing has completed, we'll be able to view the results. So what we're going to be seeing here is a list of all the different settings within the baseline that have failed, that are in this case non-compliant. And I can see that many of these configuration items are indeed non-compliant within my particular system. Let's go over and actually look at the individual settings. And I can see the failures. And what I can use this information for is to go back to my baseline and perhaps either remove some settings that don't apply to my environment, or perhaps tweak those settings so that it better reflects my current configuration. When I've done that, I can go ahead and save those settings, and then I can deploy those this particular configuration baseline out to SCCM, and then allow SCCM to continue to do the work of assessing systems within my environment against the rules defined within this configuration baseline. The third and last scenario to cover in today's short introduction to Baseline Manager is baseline maintenance. So one of the things Baseline Manager is able to do is, after you make changes to a baseline, perhaps in this case we've made some changes to to tune this baseline prior to deployment. Whenever I check in those changes, it's going to automatically track the changes that have been made to the baseline. So this is just the initial check-in. So let's go ahead and check that in. Close those results. When I reopen and edit this particular baseline, in fact, we're going to check it out for editing. And anytime I do make a change to the baseline, save it, and check it back in, we're going to automatically detect the changes that have been made to the baseline. Here we can see that we've removed several CIs. I can add a comment that reflects, perhaps a work order number or some other characteristic of why we made these changes, and I can check that in. And what that begins to do then is to create an audit history and a version history of this particular baseline. So at any point in time, I can revert back to an earlier baseline, and I can also look at the audit history of changes that have been made to that baseline. So we hope in today's demonstration you've seen those 3 key scenarios that are addressed by Baseline Manager, and we encourage you to contact Silac.com if you're interested in getting an evaluation copy of Baseline Manager to run within your environment.